Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, all is not rosy in the EU and dealing with the Brexit. European Council President Donald Tusk has said either there will be no Brexit or there will be a hard Brexit. This is in response to British Prime Minister Theresa May's comments that the UK will start to act like a sovereign country, making its own laws and decisions, which will be decided in Westminster, not Brussels. Well, stay with us as we take a look at the latest in the Brexit and effects on both sides of the coin.
Britain voted to leave the EU in June, hoping it wouldn't have to abide by EU rules and take in refugees. But ever since Britain decided to leave the bloc, British leaders have done their utmost to postpone a full Brexit, as breaking away from the EU would affect the British economy and directly and indirectly put millions of jobs at risk. Britain has said it will begin the withdrawal process before the end of March next year. Angered by the Brexit decision, EU leaders have been pushing Britain to leave the bloc as soon as possible and warned of a hard Brexit. EU leaders argue that giving Britain concessions would pave the way for other countries to follow suit without wanting to face the consequences. In her latest comments, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said Britain is unable to get single market access with free movement concessions. Merkel's comments echo the comments of other European leaders, including the French president, who's warned London of a hard Brexit. Meanwhile, Scotland, which mostly voted in favour of staying in the EU, is pushing to stay in the bloc. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is planning to strengthen Scotland's trade links with the EU before a full Brexit. She's also announced a new independence referendum bill with hopes to break away from the UK before it quits the EU.
So I think that what we're looking for is not to help the Tories out of the mess that they've got themselves in, or UKIP or whatever, but actually to have a set of demands that either Labour puts on the agenda, puts on the negotiations. If they want to see our Europe of free labour, of workers being able to move about, they must put the demand now and find the forces in Britain to be able to impose that onto the Tories.
The value of the British currency has fallen 18% since the Brexit vote in June, which is the lowest level in 168 years. Now, months on, the Bank of England has announced that inflation will surpass the bank's official 2% target over the coming years because of the fall in the value of the pound. The governor of the bank, Mark Carney, has warned that the inflation will affect the most vulnerable in Britain in the coming months. Bank of England has also signaled that it may cut interest rates for a second time later this year to save more jobs, while making it clear that it will not take orders from politicians.
Inflation went up from 0.5% to 0.6%. That's 0.1% increase in the last month. Now, really, the inflation target is actually well below the legislative requirement for the Bank of England to set a 2% inflation target, to work towards that. Most economists actually think that inflation should be around 2% to have sufficient economic growth that will help the economy grow, help the government deal with the enormous debts that it has.
Many experts believe that the worst of the Brexit fallout is still to hit the UK and fall upon ordinary people, despite the numerous measures being taken to prevent economic shocks.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, Professor at California State University, Mr. Paul Sheldon Foote out of Irvine, and investigative journalist, Mr. Tony Gosling out of Bristol. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in Irvine. And Mr. Foote, so far, how do you see the ramifications of in the UK itself following the Brexit vote last summer?
I'm delighted with the Brexit vote. It was long overdue, and contrary to that short piece that came before, it was not solely based upon refugees. They should never have become involved in it. There's a big difference between a common market and free trade and between having unelected officials control your lives. And they can only, in the long term, be in the best interests of the people of the United Kingdom.
Okay. What do you think, Mr. Gosling? Can it be in the best interest? Do you think at the end of the day that this is going to benefit the British people?
Well, it's not just in the best interest of the British people, it's in the best interest of almost everybody in Europe, in fact. The trouble is that the people of Europe, in Italy, in Germany, ordinary people in France, Spain, etc., are not being asked. Well, actually, in Italy, maybe very soon they will be, but of not being asked whether they want to stay part of the European Union. Many of the words that are used by the mainstream press to discuss this entire issue, and have been in this country in the run-up to the vote back in June, the referendum, have been, they talk about the EU as Europe. Of course, the EU is not Europe. The EU is a monstrous bureaucracy based in Brussels, which has very little, if any, real democratic accountability. And people across the continent, hundreds of millions, have been kind of banging their heads against this brick wall called the EU for decades now, and we've had enough. And I'm quite glad, in a way, that Britain has been the first country to sort of acknowledge this. And in a way, we've sort of set off a process, I think, which will be the final nails in the coffin of the EU. And what's happening is quite clear to me, is that there are tactics being used by the business elite, some of whom I would class as a criminal elite, who have played around with our financial system, committing fraud with impunity in the City of London and elsewhere. They're blaming everything on Brexit. As their house of cards begins to fall down, as it would have fallen down anyway, they're blaming Brexit, pointing all the fingers at the so-called nationalists. Many people didn't vote out of nationalistic reasons. They're, in a way, voting from altruistic reasons, saying, look, this whole EU thing is just not been working. So someone needs to put a stop to it. And I'm quite proud, in a way, that Britain has done that.
Well, Mr. Foote, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says she seems to be ready to play hardball with May and company, and that she wouldn't allow a country to reap the benefits but not participate in the responsibilities of the EU, specifically talking about the freedom of movement. How do you see this playing itself out? Do you think that the UK will acquiesce, or will actually Merkel and the EU change their tune?
Well, when she's informed by Mercedes-Benz that they're very upset that they're not selling Mercedes-Benz in England anymore, she's going to be in trouble. Germany needs the United Kingdom very desperately. The United Kingdom is a major importer from Germany. If they want to cut that off, the Germans will have severe problems. Their economy is not the powerhouse it used to be. They're struggling as it is today, and if they play hardball, they will lose.
So you think this is just scare tactics?
Yes, it is, from somebody who is desperately trying to stay in power. Her party has been losing in regional elections. The German people are very upset with her own refugee policy alone, not to mention those who would like to have a free Germany, and there is even a movement within Germany about leaving the European Union. So she has enough problems, and she may not even be in office that much longer.
Well, Mr. Gosling, this whole thing, you said earlier that it really, people voted not because of out of nationalism or nationalistic terms, but altruistic terms. But if we look at a lot of the individuals, and as Mr. Foote has just talked, Professor Foote has just talked about inside of Germany, this growing movement, doesn't a lot of it, though, play to in dealing with, for example, refugees or immigrants coming out of the country, that more and more there seems to be a more nationalist tendency, not only in Germany and the UK, but throughout Europe?
Well, in a way, this is a natural thing. In a way that, you know, being nationalistic doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be some kind of far-right lunatic. What they're doing, I suppose, is what in a way, what the Spanish in Catalonia have been doing, is saying that we're not happy and we're not satisfied with the way that Madrid is running our affairs, so we want a secession. I think this is what's going to happen now. Britain has started a wave of secession against the EU to actually leave. Many of these individual nations have decided that they've had enough of it, as I was saying. I mean, Donald Tusk yesterday was talking, as you said right at the very start, saying hard Brexit or no Brexit. Now, what a silly thing to say, because he's really there showing what a bully he is, I mean, we've got many, several countries in the EU who are part of the single market, but they're not part of the political union, which this was always a kind of secret attempt to get, a European army, European currency, all under one roof. There's been an attempt over the decades to pretend the EU is some kind of trade agreement, where actually it's a political union that they're trying to foist on us. The actual origins, which haven't been really discussed hardly at all in the mainstream media debate here in Britain, were actually in 1942 Berlin, Nazi Germany, where the EUropaische WirtschaftsGemeinschaft was first designed. And many people have pointed to this as basically the founding document. The Americans then, under the CIA, started to fund the American Committee for United Europe, and then the European movement, and Jean Monnet. These people were meeting during the late 1940s and early and 1950s, and then were basically behind the signing of the Treaty of Rome, which began the whole process towards this political union. This was never discussed amongst ordinary people right across the continent. It was always an elite plan to bring all these countries together out of a sense of convenience, to centralise power. And I think right across Europe, hundreds of millions of people are now saying this project is not going to happen.
So are you saying, let me just jump in here, Mr. Gosling, then with that being said, are you saying that the Americans, Americans want the EU to stay together? Can you explain why, just for our viewers?
Well, it's out of convenience, effectively. When they originally helped fund this back just after the Second World War, their idea was, look, we don't want to have to deal with 30 different embassies all the time. We just want to pick up the phone to one individual, one person, somebody like Donald Tusk, and tell him what we plan to do and what's going to happen. So, it's not surprising that the people across Europe have just got fed up with this whole idea of artificially bringing all these countries. In a way, it's a United States of Europe. And I think in America there's quite a lot of people who would suggest that the individual states might like to secede, particularly looking at these up-and-coming presidential elections and the kind of quality of candidates that there are on offer. They might want to secede from Washington too, to have their individual states run as independent countries, independent states over there. So as the corruption starts to kind of get stuck in at the very top of power across the Atlantic in Europe and in the United States, it's only natural that people will want to get rid of it. And the single market, it's silly, so silly Tusk saying this, because we know Switzerland and Norway, well, they're part of the single market, so why can't Britain be part of the single market too?
Mm-hmm. Well, what about that, Mr. Foote? Do you see, because you are in the United States, and with the situation that's happening now in the EU, one, do you see this, the European Union imploding from this as the beginning of the end? And how do you see this affecting also the United States?
Yes, I do see it breaking down, and I agree with the other speaker. One simply needs to search for David Rockefeller's comments over the years about his desire for a new world order, and everything that the predecessor said is absolutely correct. They are also having, with not just the EU, you have a difference between the EU and the Eurozone. They're having a distinction there between those who are willing to play in the Eurozone or not. There are some countries in the European Union who don't want to be part of the Eurozone. They want to have control over their own spending and their budgets. And so it is not as united as the people in Brussels would like you to believe.
And the U.S. side of things, how do you see, or do you evaluate this affecting relationships with the EU from the U.S.'s perspective and how they're dealing? Do you see that there's going to be a change in that or not? Same with you, Mr. Foote.
I think we'll deal with. I think we will deal with whomever is there. I don't think it makes any difference whatsoever. We have our own similar set of problems. We have large numbers of tax havens used by the wealthy, just as David Cameron's family got his wealth. We have those kind of connections. We have massive corruption. We have financial institutions paying Hillary Clinton $250,000 per speech. And so the same criminal gangs that are operating in Europe, we have comparable criminal gangs in the United States, and the massive corruption here too. And as the preceding speaker mentioned, we have states, very active secession groups going, Texas being the most famous of them, but in a large number of states there are active secession groups. We have long believed in this country that the government governs least, governs best, and that we should, the government that's closest to home is the best government. Ever since President Abraham Lincoln, that has been an American well-established philosophy, very contrary to the current New World Order, neoconservatives, neo-Trotskyites, Zionists, and others that we have dominating the national politics today.
So do you see, as our guest in Bristol said, Mr. Gosling said, do you see, staying with you, Mr. Foote, this having more and more of an effect also, and a situation like happening in the United States when you talk about the secessionist movements? Do you see this actually as growing over there too, as we see more and more? Of course, it's different because we're talking about nation states in Europe, but do you see that desire perhaps over there in the United States too, instead of the states just being part of the United States themselves, more and more wanting to be sovereign countries?
We definitely have a different situation. In the recent past, in the presidential elections in California, 2% of the people in California voted for all the third parties combined. This time around, we have the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, and we're talking probably 10% or more of the vote going to third parties. More and more Americans are starting to recognize that it's time to change the game, that the people who want to control this country, our media is terrible beyond belief. Thank heavens we have the internet, we have the social media. Thank heavens we have Press TV. The media is now being rejected by a huge percentage of Americans. We don't believe it anymore. And so these changes are not going to end. You can't make people that stupid again.
Well, how do you see it, Mr. Gosling? Do you see this as the beginning of a global awakening that perhaps started in the UK? Do you see this having a rippling effect, not only throughout Europe, but in the rest of the world, as our guest in Irvine was just talking about the United States?
Well, yes, I do. And when I was at the Bilderberg conference in Dresden, in Germany, back in June, just before the vote, I actually spoke to some of these, oligarchs, I suppose you'd call them, and people like James A. Johnson, who's one of the people behind the funding of Hillary Clinton from Goldman Sachs. And the very word Brexit was scary to them. You could tell almost like they would, body language, they would turn and look the other way. They didn't want to hear about it because it doesn't fit into their plans. And isn't it interesting the way that the financial elite just simply have plans and expect everything to happen as they want? They're not really interested in the millions of people that are affected by those plans. But look, just getting back to here and Britain and the effect here, you mentioned at the top of the hour about Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party saying, well, if there's a hard Brexit, then we're going to have another referendum. Well, I've got news for her, because a YouGov poll back in July, 30th of July this year, said that there's 10% more Scots who would want to stay in a post-Brexit UK. So now we've had the Brexit vote, it looks as if there would be very little chance of her winning an independence referendum. But yet she's still living in this kind of cloud cuckoo land where she thinks that all the Scots just want to stay in the EU. No, they just don't like the arrangements that there's been with Westminster and Brussels. If Britain can get away from Brussels, I think that the Scottish people, and this poll suggests that they will actually vote to stay in the United Kingdom and not to secede. So you've got quite a lot of people who are very close to the financial elite, like the SNP, who believe it's a good idea to stay with the EU, even though the people in Scotland, it looks like from this poll, don't want to do that.
All right, and on that note, we are out of time, and I appreciate both of you for being with us on this debate right here at Press TV. Mr. Paul Sheldon Foote, professor at California State University out of Irvine, and Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. Make sure you join us right here, same time, same place tomorrow. Marzieh Hashemi signing out. Thanks so much, and goodbye.